Rich man's son had only 3 days to live, until a street kid said, "Let me try." Richard Parker was sitting alone in the garden of Mercy General Hospital in New York City when he felt he couldn't endure another day. The doctors had just left the room where his son was hospitalized, and the news was the worst possible. 3 days. That was all that remained before the situation became irreversible. It was in that moment of total despair that he felt a presence beside him. Turning his face, he encountered a boy who couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, wearing a faded brown shirt and patched pants. The boy's eyes, however, held a seriousness that didn't match his age. "Your baby will get better if you let me help," said the boy without any hesitation in his voice. Richard looked at the boy with a mixture of confusion and irritation. How did this child know about his son? Who had let a street kid into the most expensive hospital in the city? "How do you know about my son?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "I see everything that happens around here," replied the boy, moving closer. "I've been sleeping in the square across the street for almost a year. I saw when you arrived with the baby 5 days ago. I saw the doctors shaking their heads. I saw the lady crying in the hallway yesterday in the early hours." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. The description was accurate. His wife, Heather, had spent the previous night in tears after the specialists admitted they no longer knew what to do. "Look, kid, I don't know what you want, but this isn't the time," said Richard, making a move to turn the wheelchair to go back into the hospital. "3 days," said the boy, making Richard stop. "The doctors said your son has 3 days, didn't they, before his brain stops responding to stimuli completely." The businessman froze. That specific information hadn't been shared with anyone except close family and the medical team. How could a street boy know this? "My name is Charlie," continued the boy, "and I know how to help your son. My grandmother taught me ancient techniques, things she learned from her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother. Things the doctors here don't know because they're in old books nobody reads anymore." "Are you serious?" Richard didn't know whether to laugh or call security. "Your son can't suck milk, can't follow sounds with his eyes, doesn't react when touched. It's as if his brain isn't connected to his body, right?" Richard felt his hands tremble. That was exactly it. The doctors had explained that little Michael, his son of just 7 months, had developed a rare neurological condition that was preventing his nervous system from functioning properly. Basic survival reflexes were disappearing one by one. "How do you know all this?" asked Richard, his voice now choked. "Because I observe. Because I listen. Because for months I've seen mothers and fathers come and go from this hospital with their sick babies, and I pay attention to every detail," replied Charlie. "And because I've seen this before, in the community where I lived before coming to the streets. My grandmother treated 3 children with the same thing your son has. And they got better?" Richard could barely ask the question. "2 did. 1 didn't have time. The parents took too long to seek help." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard looked at the garden around him, at the well-kept trees, at the imposing hospital building. He had spent a fortune over the past 5 days, consulted the best specialists in the country, and yet there he was, listening to a street boy say he knew more than all of them. "My wife is a doctor," Richard said finally, "one of the best neurologists in New York City. She would never accept that a boy, that someone without training, touches our son." "You're in a wheelchair," observed Charlie without beating around the bush. "Something bad happened to you, something the doctors couldn't completely prevent, right? And now you're afraid to trust only medicine again. That's why you're out here alone, thinking about what to do." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The car accident had happened 2 years before. The spinal injuries were irreversible, according to all the specialists. Heather had done everything in her power, consulted the best professionals, but in the end he was still confined to that chair. And now, seeing his son in the same situation of medical helplessness, Richard felt lost. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "What exactly do you want to do?" asked Richard, deciding to at least listen. "Deep sensory stimulation," replied Charlie, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Your son's brain isn't disconnected, it's just asleep." It needs specific stimuli, in the right order, with the right intensity. Sounds, smells, touches, movements. Things that wake up the parts of the brain that control basic reflexes. And you learned this from your grandmother? My grandmother Joanne was known throughout South Bronx as the woman who saved babies the doctors said wouldn't survive. She never went to any school, but she knew things that came from long ago, things that the women in our family passed down from mother to daughter for generations. Where is your grandmother now? Charlie's face closed off a bit. She passed away 8 months ago. That's when I ended up on the streets. There was no one left to take care of me. Richard felt a pang of compassion, but also of suspicion. Could all this be an elaborate story? A scam by a clever boy trying to get money from a desperate father? If I let you try, and it doesn't work, I'll have wasted precious time my son doesn't have, said Richard, weighing each word. And if you don't let me, and the doctors keep not knowing what to do, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if I could have helped, replied Charlie, looking directly into Richard's eyes. Look, I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything but a chance. If it doesn't work, you send me away and that's it. But if it works, my son has a chance. Exactly. Richard fell silent for a long moment, processing everything. Then he took out his phone and called Heather. The conversation would be difficult, he knew, but he had no choice. He couldn't live knowing he hadn't tried everything. When Heather arrived in the garden 15 minutes later, her face was marked by exhaustion and tension. She looked at Charlie with an expression that mixed surprise and indignation. "Richard, you must be joking," she said, before her husband could even speak. "You called me here to talk about a street kid who says he can cure our son." "Heather, I know how this sounds, but it sounds like madness," she interrupted, her voice rising. "We have the best doctors in the United States taking care of Michael, specialists who studied for years, who have experience, who know exactly what they're doing." "And they said there's nothing more to be done," said Richard calmly. "They said all we can do is wait and hope for a miracle. Because it's a rare condition, because medicine is still studying it, still trying to understand, and meanwhile our son is up there losing a little more of himself with every passing hour." Richard interrupted, his voice heavy with emotion. Heather looked at Charlie, who had remained quiet throughout the argument. The boy met her gaze, not looking away. "You're not even 10 years old," said Heather, trying to control her tone. "How can you think you know more than trained doctors?" "I don't know more," replied Charlie. "I just know different. The hospital's medicine looks at the body as a broken machine that needs fixing. What my grandmother taught me looks at the body as something alive that needs to be awakened again." "That makes no medical sense," said Heather, crossing her arms. "Does the doctor know the history of primitive reflexes?" asked Charlie. Heather blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, of course. They're reflexes babies are born with, like the sucking reflex, the grasping reflex. And does the doctor know these reflexes can be reactivated through specific sensory stimulation, even when they seem to have disappeared?" Heather hesitated. It was true. There were studies about that, especially in neurological rehabilitation therapies. But they were complex techniques that required specialized equipment. "You're talking about sensory integration therapy," said Heather slowly. "But that's done with equipment, with specific protocols. Or with hands, with sounds, with smells, with movements," completed Charlie. "The way people did before hospitals existed." Richard watched his wife. He could see the conflict on her face. The doctor in her completely rejected the idea, but the desperate mother was starting to consider it. "Heather," said Richard softly, "what do we have to lose?" "Our credibility," she answered, but her voice was already less firm. "If anyone finds out we allowed an untrained child to treat our son—" "Nobody needs to know," said Richard. "It can be discreet. Just let him try, please." Heather looked at her husband, then at Charlie, then at the hospital building where their son was admitted. Finally, she took a deep breath. "3 attempts," she said, raising 3 fingers. 3 half-hour sessions. If there's no improvement, no reaction, you leave and never come back. And all of this supervised by me, understood?" Charlie nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. "That's fine, but I'll need a few things." "What kind of things?" asked Heather, suspicious. Aromatic herbs from the market, rosemary, basil, lemon balm, a small bell, like the ones they sell in craft stores, a piece of soft cotton cloth, and permission to come and go from the hospital without security stopping me all the time. Heather looked at Richard, who just shrugged. "I'll talk to the administration," said Richard. "I'll say you're a special consultant we hired." "In street clothes?" asked Heather, skeptical. "Then we'll buy new clothes for him," said Richard simply. That's how an hour later Charlie found himself in the clothing store at the mall next to the hospital, trying on new shirts and pants. Heather had insisted on accompanying him, partly because she didn't trust leaving him alone with Richard, partly because she wanted to observe the boy more closely. "You never told me your last name," commented Heather, while Charlie tried on a blue shirt. "I don't have one," replied the boy. "I mean, my mother's birth certificate said Smith, but she never used it. And after she left, I stayed with my grandmother, and she just called me Charlie." "Your mother left?" asked Heather, softening her voice. "She had problems," said Charlie, choosing his words carefully. "Problems she tried to solve in ways that didn't work. One day she went out and never came back. I was 6. Heather felt a tightening in her heart. Here was a child who had lost everything, who lived on the streets, and yet had the courage to offer help to others. "And your grandmother taught you all these techniques when you were very little?" "Ever since I can remember," said Charlie, looking at himself in the mirror with the new clothes. "She always said I had the gift, that I felt things others didn't. When a baby was sick, she'd take me along and I'd help. I'd hold the child, sing the songs she taught me, make the right movements." "Did it work?" Charlie looked at her through the reflection in the mirror. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. My grandmother always said we could only do what was within our reach, that the rest didn't depend on us." Heather stayed quiet for a moment, processing that. It was a humble philosophy, very different from the medical arrogance she sometimes saw in colleagues who believed they could control everything. "Let's see if these clothes fit," she said, changing the subject. An hour later, Charlie stood before the room where Michael was hospitalized. He wore new jeans and a simple white shirt. His feet, once bare, now had new sneakers. In his hands he carried a bag with the herbs he had requested, the bell and the cotton cloth. Richard was by the door, in the wheelchair. Heather was inside the room, watching her son sleeping in the special crib, connected to monitors and machines. "Ready?" asked Richard. Charlie nodded but didn't move immediately. "You'll have to trust me," said the boy. "Some things I'm going to do will seem strange, but you can't interrupt me in the middle or it won't work." "I understand," said Richard. "And the doctor needs to stay quiet," added Charlie. "I know it'll be hard for her, but she can't ask questions or make comments while I'm working." Richard took a deep breath and entered the room, followed by Charlie. Heather turned when they came in, and for the first time, Charlie could see the baby he had come to try to help. Michael was a baby with light hair and pink skin, who seemed to be sleeping peacefully. But Charlie knew from observing through the room's window over the past few days that it wasn't normal sleep. It was the stillness of a body that wasn't responding to the world's stimuli. "Can I hold him?" asked Charlie. Heather hesitated, but eventually agreed with a nod. Carefully, Charlie approached the crib and, with surprising gentleness for a child, picked Michael up in his arms. The baby didn't react. He didn't open his eyes, didn't move, didn't make a sound. Charlie sat in the armchair next to the crib and settled Michael in his lap. Then he began to do something that left both Richard and Heather completely baffled. He started murmuring a low melody, almost inaudible, while his hands moved gently over the baby's little body. It wasn't a regular massage. The movements had a specific rhythm, a sequence that seemed to follow a pattern. "What are you doing?" Heather couldn't help but ask. Charlie didn't answer, focused on what he was doing. His fingers lightly pressed specific points on Michael's tiny feet, belly, chest, forehead, always accompanying the melody he was humming. 5 minutes passed, 10, 15. Heather was about to end the session when something happened. One of Michael's little toes moved. It was such a small, subtle movement that Heather thought she had imagined it, but then it happened again. And once more. "Richard, are you seeing this?" she whispered. Richard had tears in his eyes. Yes, he was seeing it. For the first time in 5 days, his son had moved voluntarily. Charlie continued for another 10 minutes, until the agreed-upon half-hour was complete. When he stopped, he carefully returned Michael to the crib. "I'll come back tomorrow morning," he said simply. "And tomorrow I'll bring the sense." Heather was in shock. She had checked the monitors throughout the entire session, and although Michael's vital signs remained stable, there was something different. A slight change in brain activity that the machines had picked up. "How did you do that?" she asked, as Charlie was already leaving. The boy turned and gave a small smile. "I woke a little bit of him up. Tomorrow I'll wake a bit more." After Charlie left, Heather and Richard were alone in the room with Michael. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I saw it," said Heather finally. "I saw his finger move. I saw it too. This doesn't make sense. There's no scientific basis." "Heather," Richard interrupted gently, "maybe there are things science doesn't fully understand yet. Maybe this boy knows something that's been forgotten, something that worked before there were hospitals and machines." Heather didn't answer, but for the first time in days, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Charlie arrived early. So early that the sun was still rising when he appeared in the hospital garden. Richard was already there, having been unable to sleep properly all night. "Did you sleep here?" asked Charlie, sitting down next to the wheelchair. "In the room next to Michael's," Richard replied. "And you? Where did you sleep?" Charlie shrugged. "The usual place. In the square." Richard felt a pang of guilt. Here was a boy who had just given his son the first hope in days, and he still slept on the street. "That's going to change," said Richard, determined. "Starting today, you'll sleep in a real place." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Richard interrupted. "It's not charity, it's logical. If you're going to treat my son, you need to be rested, well-fed, in a condition to do the best work possible." Charlie looked at him with an expression hard to decipher. "You're clever," he said finally. "Turn a favor into business, so I don't feel bad accepting." Richard smiled. "Learned that in years of being a businessman. But seriously, Charlie, you gave me hope yesterday. The smallest of hopes, but hope nonetheless. Let me do this for you." "All right," Charlie agreed. "But only until Michael gets better. After that, I go back to my spot." Richard didn't argue, though he already had other plans in mind. When they went up to Michael's room, they found Heather already awake, leaning over the crib. She turned when she heard the door open. "He moved again," she said, her voice full of emotion. "An hour ago on his own. Moved his little toes, exactly like he did yesterday when you were here." Charlie nodded, as if he expected it. "His body is starting to remember," he explained. "It's like the muscles and nerves have forgotten how to do things, and we're teaching them again." He took bundles of herbs from his bag that he had bought. Rosemary, basil, lemon balm, mint. The strong smell immediately filled the room. "May I?" he asked, pointing to Michael. Heather nodded, and Charlie picked up the baby again. This time he brought the rosemary close to Michael's face, letting the strong aroma reach the child's nose. At first, nothing happened. But then, very slowly, Michael's nostrils twitched, an instinctive reaction to the strong smell. "Yes," whispered Charlie, encouraged. "That's it, little one. You're in there, you just need to wake up." He alternated between the herbs, bringing each one close for a few seconds, then moving it away. And each time Michael's reaction became a bit more visible. First just the nostrils, then the whole face scrunching slightly, then a movement of the mouth. Heather watched everything with clinical attention, but also with the heart of a mother who desperately wanted to believe. She had spent the night reading about sensory integration therapies, about old studies on neurological stimulation, and though she didn't want to admit it, she had found evidence that this kind of approach could indeed have effects. "Modern medicine has forgotten a lot of things," said Charlie, as if he could read her thoughts. "My grandmother always said that. She said that before, when people didn't have doctors or hospitals, they had to learn to take care of each other in other ways, and some of those ways worked very well." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," said Heather, surprising herself. "She was," Charlie agreed sadly. She died from something doctors probably would have cured easily. She didn't have money to go to the hospital, and when someone finally called an ambulance, it was too late. The silence that followed was heavy. Heather thought of the irony. Charlie's grandmother had helped so many people, but when she needed help, there was no one to help her. "I'm sorry," Heather said sincerely. "She always said that everyone has their time," Charlie replied, "and that the important thing was to do good while we were here." He continued working with Michael for another half-hour, alternating between scents, touches, and melodies. And when he finished, he left the baby in the crib with a small smile on his face. "Tomorrow I'll bring the sounds," he said, "and I think tomorrow is when we'll see a bigger change." But it was that same afternoon that things started to get complicated. Dr. Albert Freeman, the chief neurologist of the hospital, entered Michael's room without knocking. He was a tall man with graying hair and a rigid posture, known both for his competence and his difficult personality. "Dr. Heather," he said formally, "we need to talk." Heather stood up from the chair where she was sitting beside Michael's crib. "About what, Dr. Albert?" "About the fact that you allowed a street kid, without any medical training, to enter this room and handle your son." Heather felt her blood run cold. How had he found out? "Who told you that?" "One of the nurses saw the boy leaving the room with you yesterday," replied Dr. Albert, "and I myself just saw him in the hallway a little while ago, carrying aromatic herbs as if he were a healer from the last century." "Dr. Albert, I can explain." "There is no explanation that justifies this," he raised his voice. "You are a doctor, Heather, a respected professional. How can you risk your own son's life with these superstitions?" Richard, who was outside the room, heard the argument and quickly entered. "Dr. Albert, with all due respect, my son is under our care, and—" "Your son is under the care of this hospital," Dr. Albert interrupted him. "And as long as he is admitted here, the rules of this hospital must be followed. And one of those rules is that only qualified healthcare professionals can have direct contact with patients. The hospital rules also say that parents have the right to seek complementary opinions," Richard countered, trying to remain calm. "A complementary opinion from another doctor, yes, not from a street kid practicing quackery." The word echoed through the room like a slap. Quackery. "Michael moved his fingers yesterday for the first time in 6 days," said Heather, her voice firm despite the tremor. "After the session with Charlie, and this morning he moved again, on his own." "Coincidence?" said Dr. Albert categorically. "Or worse, a random reaction that you're misinterpreting because you desperately want to believe there's hope." "It wasn't a coincidence," Heather insisted. "Then explain to me, from a medical standpoint, how a boy with no formal education can achieve what a team of specialists could not." Heather hesitated. She knew the answer. She knew about sensory integration and primitive neurological stimulation, but she also knew how it would sound coming from her. "There are ancient techniques," she began. "Ancient techniques?" Dr. Albert almost spat the words. "Are you telling me you're entrusting your son's life to ancient techniques passed down through generations by people with no scientific knowledge?" "Not everything old is invalid," said Richard, "and not everything modern is guaranteed." Dr. Albert looked at Richard with a pitying expression. "I understand your desperation, Richard. I truly do. But allowing your physician wife to succumb to this kind of irrational thinking is dangerous, for your son and for her reputation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "My reputation is worthless if my son doesn't survive," said Heather, her voice breaking. "And if there's a chance, however small, that Charlie might help, I'm going to try." "Then you'll have to make that attempt somewhere else," said Dr. Albert, inflexible, "because if that boy enters this hospital again, I will call security and file a formal report with the medical board about your conduct." "You can't do that," said Richard, alarmed. "I can and I will," replied Dr. Albert. "As the physician in charge of the pediatric ward of this hospital, I have a duty to protect all patients from unapproved practices." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Heather, you're an excellent doctor. Don't throw all that away because of a desperate fantasy. Accept that some cases have no solution, no matter how painful it is." After he left, Heather collapsed into the chair, her face in her hands. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Richard approached and held his wife's hand. "We're taking Michael home," he said, determined. "What? We can't. He needs the monitors, the hospital support." "We can rent the equipment," said Richard, "hire private nurses to stay at home 24 hours, and allow Charlie to continue the treatment." "This is madness. It's the only option," Richard interrupted her, "unless you want to give up on Charlie and accept that there's nothing more to be done." Heather looked at the crib where Michael slept, completely unaware of all the drama happening around him. She thought about the 2 moments of movement she had witnessed in the last 24 hours. Could they really be coincidence? Or was there something there that she was willing to ignore out of professional pride? "Let's take him home," she said finally. "Today." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Richard used all his contacts to arrange the necessary medical equipment. He hired 2 experienced nurses who were willing to work in shifts at their home. He organized a private ambulance for transport. Dr. Albert tried to block the discharge, claiming that Michael wasn't in condition to leave the hospital. But Richard had resources and lawyers and knew exactly what his legal rights as a father were. By 5 in the afternoon, Michael was being carefully placed in the ambulance. Charlie watched everything from afar, from the hospital garden. He hadn't been told anything, but from the commotion he guessed what was happening. It was Heather who came to him. "We're taking Michael home," she explained. "The hospital isn't allowing you to continue the treatment here." "I understand," said Charlie with a small, sad smile. "The grey-haired doctor really didn't like me, did he? It wasn't personal." "I know," Charlie interrupted her. "People are afraid of what they don't understand. My grandmother always said that." "But I'd like you to continue helping Michael," said Heather quickly. "At our house, if you accept." Charlie looked at her, surprised. "Are you serious, Mum?" "Very serious. Richard has already arranged a room for you, and will pay for everything you need. You can continue the sessions with Michael there, without interference from anyone." "For how long?" "For as long as needed." Charlie stayed quiet for a moment, processing that. Getting off the streets, sleeping in a real house, having food every day, being able to care for the baby properly. "Okay," he said simply. The Parkers' house was in an upscale neighborhood of New York City, a modern 3-story building with a garden and a pool. Charlie had never seen anything like it in his life. When the ambulance parked in front and he got out of Richard's car, he just stood there staring. "It's so big," was all he could say. "Very empty too," replied Richard with a sad smile. "Before the accident, I worked so much I was hardly home. And after the accident, well, a 3-story house isn't very practical for someone in a wheelchair. They had adapted one of the ground floor rooms for Michael, with all the necessary medical equipment. The nurses were already there, organizing everything. Heather supervised every detail, her medical training not allowing anything to be left to chance. Charlie's room was next to Michael's. It was a simple but comfortable space. It had a real bed, a closet, a desk. For Charlie, who had spent the last 8 months sleeping on park benches, it seemed like a palace. "You can take a shower and rest a bit," said Richard. "Tomorrow morning early you start the sessions with Michael again." Charlie nodded, still processing everything. It was all too fast, too surreal. That night Charlie couldn't sleep well. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet. He was used to the sounds of the street, the hard park bench. Several times during the night he woke up, disoriented, forgetting where he was. But early in the morning, when the sun began to rise, Charlie knew exactly where he was and what he needed to do. He got up, washed his face, and went to Michael's room. The night shift nurse was there, monitoring the vital signs. "Good morning," said Charlie. "Good morning," replied the nurse, a middle-aged woman named Judith. "You're the boy who's going to do the special treatment?" "I am." Judith looked at him with a skeptical expression, but said nothing. Heather had left clear instructions. Charlie had full permission to do whatever he thought necessary, as long as it didn't put the baby at physical risk. Charlie approached the crib and looked at Michael. The baby was awake, his light blue eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. "Good morning, little one," said Charlie softly. "Today we're going to do something different." He picked up the baby carefully, sat in the armchair, and settled Michael in his lap. Then he took the small bell he had bought out of his pocket. The sound was soft, delicate. Charlie shook the bell near Michael's left ear, then near his right. He watched for any reaction, any change in the baby's expression. At first, nothing. But Charlie was patient. He knew from his grandmother's stories and his own experience that these processes were slow. There were no instant miracles, only gradual progress. He continued for 20 minutes, alternating the bell with his own voice, humming softly melodies his grandmother had taught him. And then it happened. Michael turned his head, just a few millimeters, but he turned toward the sound of the bell. "Did you see that?" Charlie asked Judith, excited. The nurse approached, observing. "Turn his head?" "Yes, I saw. But it could have been—" "It wasn't a reflex," Charlie interrupted her. "It was intentional. Look." He rang the bell again, this time on the other side. And Michael, very slowly, turned his head in the opposite direction. Judith's eyes widened. "My God! I need to call the parents." Heather and Richard rushed into the room 5 minutes later, both in their pajamas. Heather's face was pale with anxiety. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He's more than okay," said Judith, still processing what she had seen. "Show them, Charlie." Charlie repeated the exercise with the bell. And to Heather and Richard's joy and shock, Michael turned his head following the sound. Once, twice, 3 times. Heather covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. "He's responding," she whispered. "He's really responding." Richard's face was also wet with tears. He took Heather's hand and squeezed it tightly. 3 days, said Charlie, breaking the emotional moment. The doctor at the hospital said Michael had 3 days before it became irreversible. Today is the 2nd day. Then we still have time, said Richard. We do, agreed Charlie. But I'll need to intensify the treatment. More sessions per day, more varied stimuli. I'm going to need more things. Make a list, said Richard immediately. I'll buy everything you need. And I'll help, said Heather. I'll read everything there is about sensory integration, about primitive neurological stimulation. We'll combine your traditional knowledge with modern science. Charlie smiled. I think my grandmother would have liked that idea. The rest of the day was intense. Charlie did 4 sessions with Michael, each focused on a different sense. Sound in the morning, smell in the mid-morning, touch in the afternoon, movement in the late afternoon. And with each session, Michael showed more signs of response. They weren't big movements, but they were consistent. Turning his head, moving his fingers, furrowing his brow, opening and closing his mouth. Heather meticulously documented everything, taking photos, making notes, comparing with what she read in medical books. And the more she read, the more convinced she became that what Charlie was doing did in fact have a scientific basis. It was an old approach, forgotten by modern medicine in favor of technology and medicine. But it was valid. That night, after Michael finally fell into a real sleep, a deep sleep, not the previous stillness, Heather invited Charlie to have dinner with them. It was the first time Charlie had sat down at a table with a family to eat. The last time he had done that was with his grandmother, months before she passed away. And even then it was a simple table with basic food. Here, in the Parkers' dining room, there was a large table, comfortable chairs, food prepared by a professional cook. Charlie felt out of place, but Richard and Heather did their best to make him feel comfortable. Tell us more about your grandmother, asked Heather, about how she learned these techniques. Charlie took a sip of juice before answering. My grandmother's family came from the countryside of Louisiana, from a very small place far from everything. There was no hospital there, so people learned to take care of each other. The older women taught the younger ones, and so the knowledge was passed down. And when did your grandmother come to New York City? When she was about 20 years old. She came to try for a better life, like so many people. But she never forgot the things she learned there. And when she started having children and later grandchildren, she used that knowledge. How many children did she have? 3. My mother was the youngest, but only she survived to adulthood. The other 2 didn't make it. The silence that followed was heavy. Heather thought about how difficult it must have been for Charlie's grandmother to lose 2 children, even knowing healing techniques. That's why she was so determined to help other children, continued Charlie, seeming to guess Heather's thought. She said if she couldn't save her own children, At least she would save others' children. She saved my son, said Richard, his voice full of emotion, through you, and I will never forget that. Charlie looked away, clearly uncomfortable with such intense gratitude. Michael isn't cured yet, he said. There's still a lot of work ahead. But there is hope, said Heather, and that's already a lot. The next morning, the third day, Charlie woke up with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It was the last day before Michael's condition could become potentially irreversible. Everything he had learned, everything his grandmother had taught him, would be put to the test. He started the sessions even earlier before the sun had fully risen, and this time he wasn't alone. Heather was there too, watching every movement, every technique, asking questions when appropriate. "Do you always press these specific points on the feet?" asked Heather, observing. "Not always," replied Charlie. "It depends on what the baby needs. These points here," he indicated, "are connected to the central nervous system. My grandmother said they were like buttons that turned on parts of the body." "Acupressure," said Heather, recognizing it. "There are studies about this in newborns." "I don't know what it's called," said Charlie honestly. "I just know it works." He continued the work, alternating between gentle and slightly more intense stimuli. Michael was responding better and better. His eyes followed the movement of Charlie's hands. His mouth opened when the strong smell of the herbs came near. His tiny fingers closed when Charlie touched the palm of his little hand. But the most important reflex was still missing: sucking. Without it, Michael wouldn't be able to feed properly, and without feeding, his condition would keep deteriorating. "Today, I need to try to make him suck," said Charlie, more to himself than to Heather, who, "It's the most important thing." "How are you going to do that?" "There's a technique my grandmother used, but I need honey." Heather hesitated. "Honey? But babies under 1 year shouldn't have honey." "It's not for him to eat," explained Charlie. "It's just to put a little on my finger and let him taste it. The sweetness stimulates the sucking reflex." Heather was still skeptical, but decided to trust him. She went to get the honey from the kitchen herself and came back with the jar. Charlie dipped the tip of his pinky finger in the honey and then gently touched Michael's lips. The baby didn't react immediately. Charlie waited, patiently. Then he touched again, this time leaving his finger there a bit longer, and then very slowly, Michael's little mouth moved, once, twice. "He's trying," whispered Charlie, emotional. "Come on, little one. You can do it." He repeated the process several times, always very carefully, and with each attempt Michael's response got a little stronger, until finally, on the 10th try, the baby not only moved his lips but actually sucked on Charlie's finger for a brief second. Heather couldn't hold back her tears. He did it. He really did it. "It's not over yet," said Charlie, but he was smiling. "He did it once, but he needs to do it consistently. It needs to become automatic again." They spent the next hours working on it. Charlie, with his endless patience, repeating the exercise over and over. Heather noting everything, timing the responses, monitoring the vital signs. And then, in the middle of the afternoon on the third day, the moment that changed everything happened. Charlie was holding Michael, doing the usual exercises, when the baby turned his head on his own without any stimulus, and searched for Charlie's chest with his mouth. It was an instinctive, primitive movement, the rooting reflex that all healthy babies have. "Heather!" called Charlie urgently. "Quick, bring the bottle." Heather didn't question it, just ran to get it. When she returned, Charlie carefully positioned the bottle's nipple near Michael's lips. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, to the indescribable joy of everyone in the room, Michael latched onto the nipple and began to suck. Weak at first, but getting stronger and stronger. Judith, the nurse who had been following everything, had tears streaming down her face. "It's a miracle," she whispered. "It's not a miracle," said Charlie softly. "It's just his body remembering what it always knew how to do." They stayed there, watching Michael drink almost half the bottle before he got tired and let go of the nipple. It was more than the baby had taken in over the past 6 days combined. When Richard came home that afternoon, he had been out handling some urgent company matters, he found Heather crying in the living room. His heart nearly stopped. "What happened?" Michael, he took the bottle, said Heather between sobs. He sucked, swallowed, did it all by himself. Richard, our son is going to be okay. He really is going to be okay. Richard couldn't hold back his emotions. There, in the wheelchair, in the middle of the living room, he broke down in tears. All the days of fear, of helplessness, of despair, finally found an outlet. "Where's Charlie?" he asked, when he managed to pull himself together. "In his room, resting. He worked non-stop all day." Richard went to Charlie's room and knocked on the door. When the boy opened it, he found Richard with his eyes still red. "Thank you," was all Richard could say. "Thank you for not giving up on my son, for believing when no one else did." Charlie seemed uncomfortable with so much emotion. "I just did what my grandmother would have done," he said. "No." Richard shook his head. "You did much more than that. You gave a shattered family a chance to go on. And that is priceless." That night, for the first time in many days, everyone in the house slept peacefully. Michael was sound asleep, his vital signs stable and strong. Heather and Richard slept in each other's arms, finally allowing themselves to relax. And Charlie slept in the comfortable bed, dreaming of his grandmother, imagining she would be proud. But the story was far from over. The next morning, the fourth day, Charlie continued the work of reinforcing Michael's reflexes. The baby was responding better and better, but Charlie knew he needed to consolidate all the progress, make it permanent. It was during one of the sessions that Heather brought unexpected news. "Dr. Albert called," she said. "He found out we took Michael out of the hospital and wants to make a home visit. He says it's standard procedure, but I think he wants to see if we're really taking good care of Michael or if we're being negligent." "When?" asked Charlie. "This afternoon." Charlie and Heather exchanged a worried look. Dr. Albert had made his opinion about Charlie's methods clear. If he saw that they were continuing with the alternative treatment, it could cause problems. "Maybe it's better if you're not here when he arrives," Heather suggested reluctantly. "No," said Charlie firmly. "I'm not going to hide. Michael is getting better, and that's what matters. If the doctor can't accept reality, that's his problem." Richard, when he heard about the visit, agreed with Charlie. "Let him come," he said, "and let him see with his own eyes the progress Michael has made. It'll be hard to argue with concrete results." Dr. Albert arrived at 3 in the afternoon, punctual as always. He entered the house with a look of disapproval already fixed on his face, clearly expecting to find a chaotic situation. What he found was a perfectly organized room, with all the necessary medical equipment working properly, 2 competent nurses, and a baby who was visibly better than when he left the hospital 3 days earlier. "Impressive," he said, and it wasn't sarcasm. He was genuinely impressed. "Michael's vital signs are excellent, much better than I expected." "And there's more," said Heather, unable to hide the pride in her voice. "He's taking the bottle by himself. The sucking reflex is back." Dr. Albert looked at her with clear skepticism. "That's impossible. In the condition Michael was in when he left the hospital." "See for yourself," Heather interrupted him, picking up a bottle and bringing it close to the baby. And to Dr. Albert's shock, Michael indeed took the nipple and began to suck vigorously. How is this possible?" he asked, genuinely confused. That's when he noticed Charlie, standing in the corner of the room watching everything in silence. "You," said Dr. Albert, pointing. "Did you do this?" "I helped," Charlie replied simply. "But it was Michael's body that did the work. I just gave the right stimuli." Dr. Albert looked from Charlie to Michael, then back to Charlie. His face was a mix of conflicting emotions. As a doctor, he was trained to trust only proven science, tested procedures, but there was undeniable evidence that something he had dismissed as quackery was in fact working. "I need to examine the boy properly," he said finally. "Run some tests, make sure there's really no damage." "Feel free," said Richard. "Examine him as much as you want. You'll see that Michael is recovering." Dr. Albert spent the next hour giving Michael a complete checkup. He tested reflexes, checked neurological responses, examined every aspect of the baby's development. When he finished, he sat down heavily in a chair, his face pale. "This defies everything I've learned in 30 years of medicine," he said, almost to himself. The neurological damage Michael had should be irreversible at this stage. And yet he's getting better, Heather completed softly. How? Dr. Albert looked at Charlie. What exactly did you do? Charlie explained, as best he could, the techniques he had used, the sensory stimuli, the pressure on specific points, the rhythmic melodies, the strong smells. Dr. Albert listened to everything with growing attention. It's basically a primitive form of sensory integration therapy, he said slowly, combined with acupressure and neuroplastic stimulation, techniques that exist in old medical books but were largely abandoned with the advent of modern drug treatments. My grandmother never read a medical book in her life, said Charlie, but she knew what worked. Empirical wisdom, murmured Dr. Albert. Knowledge passed down through generations, refined by practical experience rather than formal studies. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with himself. Finally, he stood up and extended his hand to Charlie. I owe you an apology, he said. I called you a charlatan, dismissed your methods without even trying to understand them. That was arrogance on my part. Charlie hesitated, then shook Dr. Albert's hand. You were just trying to protect the baby, he said. I understand. But you were right, and I was wrong, insisted Dr. Albert. And as a scientist, I need to recognize the facts when they're in front of me. He turned to Heather and Richard. I would like to document this case, he said. With your permission, of course. Do a formal study, publish it in medical journals. The world needs to know about this, about how ancient techniques can complement modern medicine. Heather and Richard exchanged a look. What do you think, Charlie? Asked Heather. Charlie thought for a moment. If this can help other babies, other families, then yes. My grandmother would have wanted that. Great, said Dr. Albert, but on one condition. I'd like you, Charlie, to participate in the study. Explain your techniques in detail. Allow doctors and therapists to learn from you. I don't know how to explain it well, said Charlie hesitantly. It's more about feeling than thinking, you know? Then let's find a way to translate that feeling into something that can be taught, said Dr. Albert. You have a rare gift, son. It would be a waste not to share it. It was the beginning of an unlikely partnership. Dr. Albert began visiting the Parkers' home daily, watching Charlie work with Michael, taking detailed notes, filming the sessions. He brought other doctors and therapists, all curious about the methods that were producing such impressive results. Some were skeptical, as Dr. Albert had been at first. But when they saw Michael, when they witnessed the baby's progressive improvement, most became advocates of this integrated approach. Heather was also working on her own research, reading everything she could find about ancient therapies, about traditional wisdom in medical treatments. And the more she read, the more convinced she became that modern medicine had lost something precious in its race for technology and specializations. Look at this. She showed Richard an old book she had found in a used bookstore. It's by a French doctor from the 19th century. He describes sensory stimulation techniques in babies that are almost identical to what Charlie uses. And did they work? According to him, yes, but they were abandoned when they started developing more scientific drugs and procedures. Progress isn't always progress, Richard observed philosophically. But while inside the house everything seemed to be going well, problems were arising from outside. A report in the local newspaper about the miracle boy who heals babies caught the attention of many people. Some were desperate parents with sick children, seeking help. Others were opportunists seeing a chance to make money. And some were journalists looking for a good, sensational story. That's how, one morning, Richard found 3 reporters and 2 camera operators camped at his doorstep. "Mr. Parker," shouted one of them, "is it true there's a healer boy living in your house?" "No comment," said Richard, trying to get past. "Your son was on the verge of death, and now he's well. Is that right? Was it this boy who saved him?" I said no comment. But the news was already spreading. On social media, in mothers' groups, in the hospital corridors. The story of the street boy who used ancient techniques to heal babies that modern medicine couldn't save. And with fame came consequences. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, Please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. One day a woman appeared at the Parkers' door holding a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. She was crying, desperate. "Please," she begged, when Richard answered the intercom. "My daughter is sick. The doctors say there's nothing to be done, but I heard about the boy who lives here that he can help." Richard felt his heart tighten. He knew this was just the first of many. But what could he do? Send the woman away? Deny help to a child in need? He opened the gate and let the woman in. Charlie was in the room with Michael when Richard appeared with the woman and the baby. "Charlie, this is Meredith," Richard introduced. "And this is her daughter. What's the name, Meredith?" "Violet," whispered the woman. Charlie looked at the baby in Meredith's arms. Even from a distance he could see the child wasn't well. The breathing was irregular, the skin pale, the eyes dull. "What did the doctors say?" asked Charlie. "Heart problems," replied Meredith. "She was born with a defect. She needs surgery, but she's still too fragile. The doctors said to wait, but I don't think she has that much time." Charlie approached and asked to hold Violet. The baby was too light, almost lifeless in his arms. "I don't know if I can help," said Charlie honestly. "What I know how to do is with the nervous system, with reflexes. Heart problems are different." "Please," Meredith began to cry harder. "Please try anything. You're her last hope." Charlie looked at Richard, who just shrugged. It was his decision. "Okay," Charlie said finally, "but you'll have to stay here with me, and you'll have to do exactly as I say without questioning. Agreed?" "Agreed," said Meredith, immediately. Charlie spent the next hour working with Violet, but it was different from the work with Michael. He didn't have the specific knowledge to deal with heart problems. All he could do was try to strengthen the baby's little body in a general way, give her more energy, more will to live. He used gentle touches on her chest, trying to stimulate circulation. He sang calming melodies, trying to regulate the heartbeat. He had Meredith hold her daughter against her chest, skin to skin, making use of the mother's body heat. When he finished, Violet seemed a little better. Not cured, far from it, but a little stronger. "This won't fix the heart problem," said Charlie, handing the baby back to Meredith. "She'll still need the surgery. But maybe, with these daily stimulations, we can make her strong enough to withstand the operation." "Can you keep treating her?" asked Meredith hopefully. "I can," agreed Charlie. "But it'll have to be here, and you'll have to learn the techniques to do at home too." "I'll learn," said Meredith excitedly. "I'll learn anything." That's how the Parker home turned into an improvised clinic. Meredith came back every day with Violet, and she wasn't alone. Other parents who had heard about it started showing up. Some just wanted advice. Others brought babies with various problems. Charlie tried to help everyone, but it soon became clear it was too much work for one person. He still had to take care of Michael, who, although much better, still needed daily sessions. And now he had all these other children too. Heather saw what was happening and had an idea. "What if we formalized this?" she suggested one night during dinner. "Created something like an integrative treatment center, combining modern medicine with those traditional techniques Charlie knows." "Are you talking about opening a clinic?" asked Richard. "More than that. I'm talking about a research and treatment center, a place where doctors and therapists can learn these ancient techniques, study them, improve them, and where families without means can bring their children for free treatment." "That would cost a fortune," observed Richard. "And you have a fortune," countered Heather. "A fortune that's worthless if it's not used for something that truly matters." Richard looked at Charlie, who was quiet, listening to the conversation. "What do you think, Charlie?" The boy took his time to answer. "My grandmother always said that knowledge not shared is knowledge lost," he said finally. "If we can teach others to do what I do, help more children, then I think we should try." "Then it's decided," said Richard, slapping the table. "We'll create this center." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Richard used his contacts and his fortune to buy a suitable building and renovate it. Heather used her medical connections to recruit professionals interested in learning and researching. And Charlie, for the first time in his life, found himself in the position of teacher. It was strange for him, teaching educated adults things he had learned so naturally. But he made an effort, trying to explain not just the physical movements, but also the sensitivity, the intuition, the feeling that was so essential. Dr. Albert became the medical director of the center, ensuring everything was done according to safety and ethical standards. But he was also one of Charlie's most dedicated students, determined to fully understand those ancient techniques. The Joanne Integrative Medicine Center, named in honor of Charlie's grandmother, opened its doors 6 months after the first time Charlie touched Michael's feet. The inauguration was a major event, with doctors, journalists, and many families who had been helped by Charlie in attendance. Michael was there too, now a 1.5 years old, walking, talking, and completely healthy. No one looking at him would believe that cheerful baby had been on the brink of an irreversible neurological condition. But not everything was rosy. The center's success also brought criticism. Some doctors accused him of promoting pseudoscience. Some religious groups claimed he was practicing witchcraft. Some opportunists tried to copy Charlie's methods, offering fraudulent services that didn't work and tarnished the center's reputation. There was even an attempt to sue the center, led by a group of conservative doctors who claimed the practices weren't science-based. But Dr. Albert and Heather had been meticulous in documenting everything, conducting controlled studies, and publishing results in respected medical journals. And the numbers spoke for themselves. 73% of children treated at the center showed significant improvement in their conditions. The most difficult case Charlie faced was a 5-year-old boy named Gabriel. He had suffered an accident that caused severe brain damage. Doctors said he would spend the rest of his life in a vegetative state. Gabriel's mother, a woman named Teresa, brought her son to the center as a last resort. Charlie, upon seeing the boy, felt something familiar. A deep desire to help, but also uncertainty about whether it would be possible. "I'll be honest with you," Charlie told Teresa. "I've never worked with anyone in this condition before. It's always been babies with nervous systems still developing. Gabriel is already 5 years old. His brain is different." "But will you try?" asked Teresa, her voice full of pleading. "I will," Charlie promised, "but I can't guarantee anything." Working with Gabriel was completely different from working with babies. The boy was bigger, heavier, and the damage he had suffered was more extensive. But Charlie didn't give up. Day after day, he spent hours with Gabriel, trying to reach some part of the boy that might still be there, hidden beneath the damage. He used sounds the boy used to enjoy before the accident, cartoon theme songs, toy noises. He used smells that might awaken memories, favorite foods, his mother's perfume. He used touch and movement, trying to reactivate neural pathways that might still be partially functional. Weeks passed with no progress. Dr. Albert gently suggested that perhaps it was time to accept that some damage was truly irreversible. But Charlie refused to give up. "My grandmother always said where there's life, there's hope," he said. "And Gabriel is still alive." It was in the 8th week that something extraordinary happened. Charlie was singing a lullaby that Teresa had said was Gabriel's favorite before the accident, a simple song about a little bird flying through the sky, and in the middle of the song, Gabriel's fingers moved. It wasn't an involuntary twitch. It was a deliberate movement, following the rhythm of the music. "Gabriel," Charlie called softly. "Can you hear me, Gabriel?" The fingers moved again, and then, for the first time in months, Gabriel's eyelids fluttered. They didn't open, but they fluttered. Charlie called Teresa and Dr. Albert. When they arrived in the room, they repeated the test. And yes, Gabriel was responding. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. It took another 3 months of intensive work, but gradually Gabriel began to come back. First, just finger movements, then arm movements. Then he managed to open his eyes. Finally, one day, he looked directly at his mother and whispered one word. "Mom." Teresa broke down in tears. Dr. Albert, who witnessed the moment, had to leave the room to compose himself. And Charlie, who was now 11 years old, felt such a strong wave of emotion that he needed to sit down. "You did this," Dr. Albert said later, when they were alone. "You brought that boy back from a place modern medicine considers impossible." "It wasn't just me," said Charlie humbly. "His body did the work. I just gave the right stimuli." "Still," insisted Dr. Albert, You have an extraordinary gift, Charlie, and I'm happy you decided to share it with the world. But the success with Gabriel also brought more pressure. Families from across the country began seeking out the center, bringing children with all kinds of conditions. And although the team had grown, they now had 15 therapists trained by Charlie, plus doctors and nurses. It still wasn't enough to meet all the demand. Heather proposed a solution: create a training program. Train people from all over the United States in Charlie's techniques, so they could open similar centers in their own cities. This way, we multiply the impact, she explained. Instead of helping hundreds, we can help thousands. Charlie liked the idea, but had a concern. How do we make sure people do it right? He asked. These techniques are delicate. If done wrong, they might not work. Or worse, they could hurt someone. That's why it will be rigorous training, said Dr. Albert. 6 months of intensive coursework with constant supervision. Only those who truly demonstrate competence will receive certification. And so the Joanne School of Integrative Medicine was created, the first formal program to teach these ancient techniques combined with modern medical knowledge. Charlie, at just 12 years old, became the youngest instructor at the school. It was surreal for him to be in front of a room full of adults, many of them trained doctors and therapists, teaching things he had learned at 6 years old from his grandmother. But he did well. He had a natural patience for teaching, an ability to explain not just the how, but also the why of each technique. And his students respected him, not just for the gift he had, but for the wisdom he showed despite his young age. One of the most dedicated students was a 67-year-old woman named Constance. She had been a midwife her whole life, bringing babies into the world in a small town in rural Kentucky. But now, with the healthcare system more structured, her role had diminished. She was there to learn something new, to remain useful. My grandmother was a midwife too, Charlie told her one day. She said midwives were the guardians of ancient knowledge about babies. It's true, Constance agreed. We knew things that doctors today can't even imagine. How to soothe a colicky baby with just touch. How to strengthen a premature baby. How to sense when something wasn't right. Can you teach me those things? Asked Charlie, genuinely interested. Constance was surprised. You already know so much more than I do. But you know different things, insisted Charlie, and my grandmother always said you never stop learning. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Constance became a sort of maternal figure for Charlie, constantly reminding him of the grandmother he had lost. And Charlie, in turn, gave Constance a renewed purpose in life. Meanwhile, Michael grew up healthy and full of life. He had developed a special fondness for Charlie, following him around the house whenever he could, imitating his movements. Richard and Heather watched tenderly as that special bond formed between the boy who saved and the baby who was saved. I think he's going to want to be a doctor when he grows up, Heather remarked one day, watching Michael examine a teddy bear with the toy stethoscope he had received as a gift. Or a therapist like Charlie, added Richard, or maybe both. One day when Michael was 2 years old, something nobody expected happened. An elderly woman appeared at the center, asking to speak with Charlie. She was frail, with white hair and wrinkled skin, but had an intensity in her eyes that was impossible to ignore. I'm Lucy, she introduced herself. Joanne's sister, your great-aunt. Charlie froze. He didn't know he had any family besides his grandmother. My grandmother never spoke of you, he said carefully. We had a fight many years ago, Lucy explained sadly, over silly things I can't even remember clearly now, and when I tried to make amends, it was too late. Joanne had left us. She wiped a tear that rolled down her face. But I heard about what you're doing. I heard about a boy using the family's techniques to help children, and I knew it had to be you, the grandson Joanne always spoke of with such pride. She spoke of me? Always. She said you had the gift, that you would do great things. She was right. Lucy opened the bag she was carrying and took out an old notebook, yellowed with age. This belonged to our mother, Joanne's and my grandmother. She wrote down all the techniques, all the remedies, everything she knew about caring for children. Joanne had a notebook just like it, but I imagine you don't have it. No, said Charlie, his voice choked. When she passed, I couldn't save anything. Everything was lost. Then this is yours now, said Lucy, handing him the notebook. It's your inheritance, Charlie. the inheritance of our family. Charlie took the notebook with trembling hands. When he opened it, he saw page after page of careful handwriting describing techniques, herbs, melodies, all meticulously noted. It was a treasure trove of knowledge, passed down through generations. "Thank you," he managed to whisper. "No," said Lucy, smiling through her tears. "Thank you for honoring Joanne's memory, for continuing her work, for not letting this knowledge die." Lucy began visiting the center regularly. She also had knowledge to share, techniques different from those Joanne had taught Charlie. And together, aunt and great-nephew created an even more complete archive of traditional wisdom. But life, as always, had more twists in store. 2 years after the center opened, when Charlie was 13, Richard began to feel something unusual. It started with tingling in his legs he hadn't been able to move since the accident. Then a strange sensation, as if needles were pricking his skin. The doctors were intrigued. They ran tests, MRIs, neurological exams, and they discovered something astonishing. The injuries in Richard's spine were regenerating, not completely, but enough for some nerve pathways to be reconnecting. This shouldn't be possible," said the neurologist, looking at the results. "Injuries of this type simply don't heal on their own." "Maybe not on their own," said Heather thoughtfully. "Charlie, do you think—" Charlie understood what she was asking. "I've never tried with adults," he said, "and never with spinal injuries, but I can try." That's how Charlie began working with Richard. They weren't the same techniques he used with babies and children. He had to adapt, improvise, combine what he knew with what was in his great-grandmother's notebook. He used deep pressure along the spine. He used specific leg movements trying to reactivate muscle memory. He used mild electrical stimulation, a concession to modern technology, combined with traditional touches. Months passed with no visible progress. But Richard didn't lose hope. If Charlie had saved his son, maybe he could help him too. It was on an ordinary morning, almost a year after the treatment began, that it happened. Richard was in his wheelchair in the garden when he felt something different, a sensation stronger than the usual tingling. And then, concentrating all his will, he tried to move the big toe on his right foot. And the toe moved. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible. But it was real. Richard shouted with joy, calling everyone. Heather came running, followed by Charlie and Michael. "I moved my toe," said Richard, laughing and crying at the same time. "I really moved my toe." It wasn't a complete cure. It would take years of intensive physical therapy, and Richard would probably never walk completely normally again. But it was hope. It was possibility. It was life returning to parts of his body that had been declared dead. The news spread quickly. Soon, adults with spinal injuries were seeking out the center, wanting Charlie's treatment. And although he tried to help everyone, it became clear that his gift worked best with children. With adults, the results were more limited, slower, less guaranteed. But that didn't diminish the importance of what he was doing. Every small improvement, every tiny progress, was a miracle for the people involved. When Charlie turned 15, the Joanne Integrative Medicine Center had treated over 3,000 children. The school had graduated 200 therapists who were spread throughout the United States, opening their own centers, helping their own communities. Charlie was no longer the street kid in worn-out clothes. He wore nice clothes, lived in a comfortable home. Richard and Heather had insisted that he continue living with them, even after Michael got better, and attended a good school. But he hadn't lost his essence, his humility, his genuine compassion. Michael, now 5 years old, was his constant companion. The boy followed Charlie around the center, watching everything, asking questions, clearly fascinated by the work. And Charlie, patiently, explained everything, teaching the younger boy in the same way his grandmother had taught him. "You're preparing your successor," Heather observed one day, watching the two together. Charlie smiled. "That's how knowledge continues, from generation to generation, even if they're not blood generations." Dr. Albert, who was now 70, was considering retirement. But before retiring, he had one last project, to write a complete book about Charlie's techniques, about integrative medicine, about how the old and the new could work together to save lives. "I want you to be the co-author," he said to Charlie. "This is your story as much as it is mine." "I barely know how to write," protested Charlie. "But you know what matters," countered Dr. Albert. "You have the knowledge, the experience, the wisdom. I have the words. Together we'll create something that will help future generations." The book took 2 years to write. Every technique was documented in detail, with medical explanations, illustrations, case studies. It wasn't just a technical manual, it was a tribute to ancestral wisdom, a recognition that not all important knowledge came from universities and laboratories. When the book was released, it immediately became a medical bestseller. Universities began including it in their curricula. Hospitals started implementing some of the described techniques, and most importantly, families across the United States, and eventually the world, now had access to this knowledge that could make a difference in their children's lives. But perhaps the most significant impact wasn't on the cured children or the trained therapists. It was on the individual lives that were touched and transformed. Meredith, the woman who had appeared at the Parkers' door with little Violet, now worked at the center as an assistant. Her daughter had successfully undergone heart surgery, strengthened by the sessions with Charlie, and was now a healthy 6-year-old girl. Teresa, Gabriel's mother, had graduated as a therapist from the center's school. She now dedicated her life to helping other children with brain injuries, using the same techniques that had brought her son back. Constance, the former midwife, had become the second most respected instructor at the center, after Charlie himself. At 72, she had the energy of someone half her age, driven by the passion to share her knowledge. And Richard, who could now take a few steps with the help of crutches, had transformed his company. He redirected much of the profits to fund research in integrative medicine, created scholarship programs for low-income children to study at the Joanne School, and became a vocal advocate for the importance of combining traditional wisdom with modern science. Heather had abandoned private medical practice to dedicate herself completely to the center. As director of research, she led studies that were changing how medicine viewed neurological conditions in children. And as a mother, she had the privilege of watching her son grow up healthy, knowing she had almost lost him. But perhaps the most profound transformation had happened in Charlie. He was no longer the frightened boy who slept on park benches, without direction or hope. He was a confident young man with purpose, with a clear mission in life. But he was also someone who had never forgotten where he came from, who had never lost compassion for those still on the streets, for those who still had no hope. Once a month, Charlie returned to the square where he used to sleep. He brought food, blankets, but most of all, he brought time. He sat with the homeless people, listened to their stories, treated their wounds when possible. And occasionally, he found children like he had been and offered them a different chance. That's how he met Luke, an 8-year-old boy who had run away from an abusive home. Charlie saw something familiar in Luke, the same fear, the same fierce determination to survive, and he offered the boy the same chance that Richard and Heather had offered him. Luke, initially distrustful, eventually accepted, and he discovered he had a knack for caring for children too. He didn't have the same intuitive gift as Charlie, but he had patience, kindness, and ability to connect with traumatized children that was priceless. "You're starting your own family," observed Heather, watching Charlie mentor Luke in the same way she and Richard had mentored Charlie. "Family isn't just blood," replied Charlie. "It's about who cares, who's there for you, who helps you be better." And that became the philosophy of the center. It wasn't just about healing bodies, it was about healing entire families, about creating supportive communities, about reminding people that no one needs to face their hardships alone. When Charlie turned 18, he made an important decision. He had been accepted to several medical schools, all offering full scholarships, but he chose something different. "I want to study physical therapy in college," he announced, "and alongside that, take a course in medical anthropology." Richard and Heather were surprised. "Not medicine?" asked Heather. "With your skills, you would be an exceptional doctor." "But I don't want to be a doctor," explained Charlie. "Doctors treat diseases. I want to treat people, and I want to study how different cultures, throughout history, have cared for their sick." I want to learn more about those ancient traditions my grandmother knew, understand where they come from, document them before they are completely forgotten." "That makes sense," said Richard, nodding. "You were always more interested in preserving and teaching than in making diagnoses." Charlie spent the next years immersed in his studies. By day, he studied anatomy, physiology, rehabilitation techniques. At night and on weekends, he studied ancient texts on traditional medicine, interviewed healers and midwives from remote communities, documenting techniques that were on the brink of extinction. His thesis was an impressive compilation: infant care techniques from 20 different communities across the United States, from the indigenous peoples of the Alaskan wilderness to the descendants of freed slaves in rural Kentucky. And surprisingly, he found striking similarities between practices of groups that had never had contact with each other, evidence that certain knowledge about the human body was universal, discovered independently by different peoples. "What this tells me," Charlie explained during his thesis defense, "is that these techniques are not random superstitions. They are empirical knowledge, developed through centuries of observation and experience, and they deserve to be studied with the same respect we give to modern medical discoveries." The thesis was so well received that Charlie was invited to present it at various medical conferences, and in each presentation he planted a seed, the idea that perhaps medicine had something to learn from the past, that perhaps the race toward technological future shouldn't mean the complete abandonment of all ancient wisdom. Meanwhile, the Joanne Center continued to grow. There were already 20 branches spread across the United States, and there was interest from groups in the United Kingdom and Jamaica to open centers there as well. Michael, now 13, was firm in his decision to follow in Charlie's footsteps. He already assisted Charlie in the simpler sessions, demonstrating a natural ability that came partly from talent, partly from having been raised in that environment. "Sometimes I think how different my life would be if you hadn't shown up that day," Michael said one day while they were working together. "You probably would have been fine anyway," Charlie replied. "Maybe the doctors would have discovered something." "Or maybe not," Michael said, serious. "And I don't think it's a coincidence that you were right there in that garden at that moment. I think it was fate." "I don't believe in fate," Charlie said. "I believe in choices, and I chose to try to help." "Then it was a good choice," Michael smiled. "The best choice." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The years passed, and with them, inevitable changes. Constance, at 81 years old, finally retired, but not before personally training 20 successors. Lucy, Charlie's great-aunt, passed away peacefully at 93, but not before seeing her family's work reach thousands of people. Dr. Albert had also passed away at 75, but he left an impressive legacy. Not only the book he had written with Charlie, but also dozens of scientific articles that had changed how medicine viewed alternative therapies. Richard, now 58, could walk with a cane. It wasn't perfect, and he still used the wheelchair for longer distances, but it was far more than the doctors had said was possible after the accident. Heather, at 54, had become one of the most respected voices in integrative medicine in the country. Her research was cited in universities around the world, and she had received numerous awards for her contributions to pediatrics. And Charlie, at 25, was internationally recognized as a pioneer in integrating traditional medicine with modern practices. But the most important thing for him wasn't the awards or the recognition. It was knowing that somewhere, at that very moment, a child was being helped by techniques his grandmother had taught him. Luke, the street kid Charlie had helped years before, now worked as a social worker at the center. His specialty was helping low-income families access treatments, ensuring money was never a barrier to receiving help. Meredith had become the administrative manager of the center. Her daughter Violet, now a healthy teenager, volunteered there in the afternoons after school. And Teresa, who had seen her son Gabriel return from what seemed like an irreversible state, had opened her own center in Washington, D.C., specializing in children with traumatic brain injuries. The Joanne network of centers now covered the entire United States. More than 50,000 children had been treated over the years. Thousands of therapists had been trained. And most importantly, the knowledge was no longer at risk of being lost. It was documented, taught, preserved for future generations. But despite all the success, there was a void in Charlie's heart that nothing completely filled. He missed his grandmother, the wise woman who had taught him everything. He wished she could see what he had built, how he had honored her legacy. It was on a particularly difficult day after losing a patient, a baby who arrived too late to be helped, that Charlie found himself back in that square where he used to sleep. He sat on the same bench where he had spent so many nights and allowed himself to cry. "Grandma," he whispered to the wind. "I tried. I really tried. But sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes they come too late, or the damage is too great, or I'm just not good enough." There was no answer, of course, but Charlie could almost hear his grandmother's voice in his head, saying the same words she always said. "We can only do what's within our reach, Charlie. The rest isn't up to us." He wiped his tears and stood up. He had work to do, children to help, knowledge to teach. The pain of losing that baby would never completely disappear, but he would learn to live with it, just as he had learned to live with the loss of his grandmother. Because in the end, that's what it meant to be a healer. It wasn't about saving everyone. That was impossible. It was about making a difference when possible, about giving hope when there seemed to be none, about reminding families that they weren't alone in their struggles. When Charlie returned to the center that afternoon, he found Michael waiting for him. "I heard what happened," said the young man, now 17 and almost the same height as Charlie. "I'm sorry." "It's part of it," said Charlie, trying to appear stronger than he felt. "No, it's not," Michael corrected him. "Every loss hurts. It's supposed to hurt. If it didn't hurt, it would mean we had stopped caring." Charlie looked at the boy who had been a dying baby in his arms years ago. Michael had grown up to be not only healthy, but also wise, compassionate, exactly the kind of person the world needed. "When did you get so wise?" asked Charlie, smiling despite the sadness. "I learned from the best," replied Michael, smiling back. That evening there was a special meeting at the center. It was the 10th anniversary since its opening, and there was a celebration planned. But after the speeches and congratulations, Richard asked for attention for a special announcement. "10 years ago," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "a street kid approached me in a garden and offered me hope when there was none. He saved my son, changed my life, and ended up changing the lives of thousands of people." He looked at Charlie, who was sitting in the front row next to Heather and Michael. "Today I want to do something I should have done a long time ago. Charlie, you've been family to us since that first day. You're a brother to Michael, a son to me and Heather, and we would like to make that official." He pulled a paper from his pocket. "These are the adoption papers. I know you're already an adult, that you don't legally need parents, but we wanted you to know that, for us, you have always been and will always be our son. If you accept, of course." Charlie was speechless. Tears streamed freely down his face. He looked at Heather, who was crying too, then at Michael, who had a huge smile on his face. Charlie began, his voice breaking. "I thought I had lost my family when I lost my grandmother. But you showed me that family is something we choose, something we build. It would be an honor to be officially part of your family." The room erupted in applause. Richard, with tears streaming, hugged Charlie tightly. Heather joined the hug, followed by Michael. And there, in that moment, a family that had been forged by the most unlikely circumstances became official in the eyes of the law. But for all of them, the law was only formalizing what their hearts had known for years. The following years brought more changes. Charlie married a physical therapist named Caroline, who worked at the center and shared his passion for helping children. Together they had 2 children, a girl they named Joanne in honor of Charlie's grandmother, and a boy they named Albert in honor of the doctor who had believed in them. Michael went to medical school, but remained true to his commitment to work at the center after graduation. He specialized in pediatric neurology, combining formal medical knowledge with the techniques he had learned from Charlie. Richard, now 65, finally retired from the company. But his retirement didn't mean inactivity. He dedicated his time to traveling across the United States, visiting the various Joanne centers, meeting the families helped, ensuring each center had the necessary resources. Heather published her third book on integrative medicine. This time it was specifically aimed at parents, teaching simple techniques anyone could use at home to help their children's healthy development. And the Joanne Center continued to grow. Now there were 100 centers across the United States, and 12 more in countries in Latin America, Africa, and even in the United Kingdom. More than 200,000 children had been treated, more than 5,000 therapists trained. But numbers, as impressive as they were, didn't capture the true impact. The true impact was in the individual stories, in the mother who didn't have to say goodbye to her son, in the father who saw his daughter take her first steps when doctors said she would never walk, in the family that stayed together instead of being torn apart by tragedy. On a particularly significant day, Charlie was giving a lecture at a major university when someone in the audience raised their hand. "Have you ever regretted approaching that businessman in the garden?" the student asked. "You could have had a simpler life, less pressure, less responsibility." Charlie thought for a moment before answering. "I could have had a simpler life," he agreed, "but it wouldn't have been a better life. Every child I helped, every family I managed to support, every person I trained to continue this work, all of that gave meaning to my life. My grandmother always said, we're not here just to exist. We're here to make a difference, and I try to do that one baby at a time." The answer was met with enthusiastic applause, and in that moment, Charlie knew he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. But life, as always, had more surprises in store. When Charlie was 32, he received a call that would change everything again. It was from a hospital in Anchorage. There was a remote indigenous community in the Alaskan wilderness where an outbreak of a neurological disease was affecting dozens of children. The doctors didn't know what to do. They had heard about Charlie and wanted to know if he could help. "It's dangerous," the doctor warned over the phone. "The community is 3 days by boat from the nearest hospital. The conditions are primitive, and we don't even know exactly what's causing the symptoms." "I'll go," said Charlie without hesitation. Caroline wasn't happy with the decision. They had 2 small children now, and the idea of Charlie going to such a remote and dangerous place terrified her. But she also knew her husband. She knew he could never live with himself if he didn't try to help. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said, holding his face in her hands. "Those children need you, but our children need their father too." "I promise," said Charlie, kissing her forehead. The journey to the community was difficult. 3 days by boat down the river, passing through areas where the forest was so dense it blocked out the sun. When they finally arrived, Charlie was struck by the beauty of the place, but also by the urgency of the situation. There were 23 children affected, ranging in age from 6 months to 8 years old. All showed neurological symptoms similar to what Michael had presented years before: loss of reflexes, inability to respond to stimuli, progressive weakness. "When did the symptoms start?" Charlie asked the community's healer through a translator. 3 moons ago," replied the old man. "It started with one child, then spread to others. We tried our traditional medicines, but nothing worked." Charlie examined the children one by one, and the more he saw, the more convinced he became that it wasn't an infectious disease, but rather something environmental. Something in the environment was causing that neurological damage. "Has there been any change in the community?" he asked. "Something new that started about 3 months ago," the healer thought, then his face lit up. "The crop," he said. "We started planting a new crop, brought by traders. They said it would help us earn more money." "What kind of plant?" "I don't know the name in your language, but I can show you." When Charlie saw the crop, his heart sank. It was a plant he recognized from his research on traditional medicines, a plant that, when processed incorrectly, could release neurological toxins. "Do you eat this plant?" Charlie asked. "Yes, and we give it to the children. They told us it was nutritious." There was the problem. The plant itself wasn't poisonous, but it required a specific preparation that neutralized the toxins. The traders who had brought the seeds hadn't explained that. Charlie immediately instructed the community to stop consuming the plant, but the damage was already done. The children had ingested the toxins for months, and the effects were severe. "I can try to help," Charlie said to the healer, but it will take time and I can't promise they will all recover completely. That you will try is what matters, said the healer, gratitude in his eyes. Charlie spent the next 3 months in the community. It was the longest stay away from home he had ever done. He missed Caroline, the children, Michael, Richard and Heather, but he couldn't abandon those children. He worked with each one, using all the techniques he knew. And slowly, gradually, he began to see results. The young body has an incredible ability to recover, and with the right stimuli, the children began to improve. But it wasn't just Charlie teaching, he was also learning. The healer and the elder women of the community knew techniques he had never seen, medicinal plants he didn't know existed, forms of therapy that were completely new to him. "Why don't you teach these things to the rest of the world?" Charlie asked one day. "Who would listen?" replied the healer with a sad smile. "To the outside world, we are just primitives who know nothing." "Not everyone thinks that way," said Charlie. "There are people who understand the value of traditional knowledge. Can I connect you with them?" That's how a new initiative was born. Charlie arranged for representatives of indigenous communities from across the United States to come to the Joanne Center, not as patients or students, but as teachers. They shared their ancestral knowledge and in return learned about modern medicine. It was a truly symmetrical exchange, where both sides recognized they had something valuable to offer and something important to learn. When Charlie finally returned to New York City, after the 3 months in the Alaskan wilderness, he was welcomed as a hero. But for him, the most important thing was simply being back with his family. Joanne, his daughter, now 5 years old, ran into his arms. Albert, 3 years old, was a bit more shy, having somewhat forgotten his father during the months of absence. But soon he was clinging to Charlie too. "You seem different," observed Caroline that night when they were finally alone. "I feel different," admitted Charlie. Seeing that community, how they live so connected with nature, with their traditions, made me think a lot. We have so much knowledge, so much technology, but sometimes it feels like we've lost something essential along the way. "And what do you think we've lost?" "Connection," said Charlie simply. "Connection to the land, to our ancestors, to the wisdom that was accumulated through generations. We're so focused on moving forward that we forget to look back, to preserve what was good in the past." "So what are we going to do about it?" Charlie smiled. "We'll keep building bridges, between the old and the new, between science and tradition, between different cultures and ways of knowing. It's what we've always done, isn't it?" It was true. All the work of the Joanne Center had been about that, about building bridges between worlds that often saw themselves as opposites, but were actually complementary. The years kept passing, bringing more growth, more challenges, more victories, and also inevitable losses. Richard Parker passed away at 72, peacefully in his sleep. His last wish was for the center to keep growing, keep helping, keep uniting the old and the new. At the funeral, Michael gave a moving speech about the father who had fought to save him as a baby, who had opened his home and heart to a street kid, who had dedicated his fortune and the last years of his life to ensure that valuable knowledge wouldn't be lost. "My father taught me that real wealth isn't money," said Michael, his voice breaking. "It's making a difference. It's leaving the world a little better than you found it. And by that measure, my father was the richest man I've ever known." Charlie, now 40 years old, was in the front row, with Heather on one side and Caroline on the other. Tears streamed down his face. Richard had been much more than a benefactor. He had been a true father, someone who believed in him when few did, who gave him chances no one else would. But even in sadness, there was gratitude. Gratitude for having had Richard in his life, for all the years shared, for all the lessons learned. Heather, now 70 years old, continued working at the center. Retirement wasn't in her vocabulary. As long as she could contribute, as long as she could make a difference, she would continue. Michael had become the new general director of the center, a position that had been Richard's, and he was doing an excellent job, bringing innovations but always respecting the fundamental principles that had been established from the start. Charlie, recognizing that he needed a more sustainable pace, had reduced his direct patient care hours. Instead, he focused more on teaching, writing, and traveling the world, sharing knowledge. Their daughter Joanne, now 15, had already decided she wanted to follow in her father's footsteps. She spent weekends at the center, observing, learning, showing the same natural gift that Charlie had. "Is it genetic, do you think?" Caroline asked one day. "That gift you and Joanne have?" "I don't know," Charlie replied. "Maybe it's genetic. Maybe it's environment. Maybe it's a combination of both. What matters is that she has it, and she's choosing to use it to help others. That makes me proud." When Charlie turned 45, the Joanne Center was celebrating its 25th anniversary. There were now 200 centers spread across 30 countries. More than 1 million children had been treated. More than 20,000 therapists trained. At the celebration, they paid a special tribute. They projected on the wall photos of everyone who had been part of the journey. Joanne, Charlie's grandmother, Lucy, his great-aunt, Richard, Dr. Albert, Constance. All those who had contributed, each in their own way, to making that dream a reality. And at the end, one last photo. It was old, slightly blurry, taken by one of the nurses on that very first day. It showed Charlie, just 10 years old, holding baby Michael for the first time. Both so small, so fragile, but together beginning a journey that would change thousands of lives. "Look where we started," said Michael, now a 30-year-old man putting his arm around Charlie's shoulders, "and look where we are now." "The journey isn't over yet," Charlie replied. "There are still so many children to help, so much knowledge to preserve, so many bridges to build." "Then let's keep going," Michael said simply. And that's what they did. They kept building, they kept growing, they kept making a difference. Joanne, Charlie's daughter, graduated as a physical therapist at 23 and immediately took on a major role at the center. She had inherited not only her father's gift, but also his compassion and dedication. Albert, the youngest son, surprised everyone by choosing a different path. He became a journalist, but specialized in telling stories about integrative medicine, indigenous communities, and traditional knowledge. Through his articles and documentaries, he reached millions of people, spreading the message that Charlie had dedicated his life to promoting. Heather worked until she was 80, when she finally decided it was time to rest. But even in retirement, she still went to the center once a week, not to work, but to talk to the parents, to offer comfort, to remind everyone that there was hope even in the most difficult situations. Luke, the street kid Charlie had helped so many years before, now ran a special program at the center focused on at-risk children. He knew better than anyone what it was like to be in that situation, and he used that experience to make a real difference in the lives of hundreds of children. Meredith still worked at the center, now as a coordinator. Her daughter Violet, who had been saved by Charlie as a baby, had become a cardiologist specializing in congenital heart defects like the one she herself had had. The cycle continued. Those who had been helped were now helping others, and every person who passed through the center carried with them not only physical healing, but also a message that it was possible to overcome, that there was hope, that no one had to face their difficulties alone. When Charlie turned 50, he reflected on his journey. From the street kid sleeping on park benches to the internationally respected man, from the worn-out clothes to the diplomas on the wall, from absolute loneliness to the loving family he had built. But of all things, what made him proudest was simple. He had honored his grandmother's legacy. He had taken the knowledge she passed on to him and not only preserved it, but expanded it, adapted it, and shared it with the world. "Do you think your grandmother would be proud?" asked Caroline on a quiet evening at home. Charlie thought for a long moment. "I think she would be happy," he said finally, "not necessarily proud of all the fame or recognition, but happy because the knowledge wasn't lost. Happy because it's still helping children. Happy because I'm living a life with purpose, making a difference like she did." "You've done much more than that," said Caroline, holding his hand. "You've transformed the world." "Not the whole world," corrected Charlie modestly, "but the world of many families. And maybe that's what matters. We don't need to change the whole world. We need to change one person's world at a time." That was the philosophy that continued to guide the Joanne Center. It wasn't impressive numbers or statistics that mattered, although they were important for measuring impact. What really mattered was each individual child, each specific family, each moment when hope replaced despair. One day a young mother arrived at the center holding a baby. She was nervous, scared, clearly in a vulnerable situation. "I heard you help people," she said, her voice trembling. "That you don't charge those who can't pay." "It's true," said Joanne, who was at the reception desk that day. "Tell me about your baby." The story was familiar. Difficult birth, complications, doctors saying there were neurological damages that could be permanent, no money for expensive treatments, no hope. "You've come to the right place," said Joanne with a gentle smile. "We'll take care of your baby, and we'll teach you too so you can continue the treatment at home. You can trust us." And in that moment, seeing hope appear on that young mother's face, Joanne fully understood why her father had dedicated his life to that work. It wasn't about fame or money or recognition. It was about that exact moment. The moment when someone who was lost found a path, the moment when despair gave way to hope. That's what it meant to honor Joanne's legacy, the great-grandmother she had been named after. That's what it meant to continue the work that a street kid had started in a hospital garden so many years ago. And as long as there were children needing help, as long as there were families seeking hope, as long as there was knowledge to be preserved and shared, that work would continue. From generation to generation, from heart to heart, from healing to healing. End of story. And now, tell us what you thought of this story. Where are you following us from? What touched you most in Charlie's journey? Do you believe in the power of combining ancient wisdom with modern knowledge? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. We thank you for your company up to here. Don't forget to leave your like and, very importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.